Of the earth take their stand, and the rulers gather together against the Lord and against his anointed one. Let us break their chains, they say, and throw off their fetters. The one enthroned in heaven laughs. The Lord scoffs at them. Then he rebukes them in his anger and terrifies them in his wrath, saying, I have installed my king on Zion, my holy hill. I will proclaim the decree of the Lord. He said to me, You are my son. Today I have become your father. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your inheritance, the ends of the earth your possession. And our New Testament reading is from the Gospel of Luke, but it's the taking up the second half of the parable of the lost son from Luke chapter 15, verses 20 to 24. So he got up and went to his father, but while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him and kissed him. The son said to him, Father, I have sinned against you, against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his servants, Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate, for this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. So they began to celebrate. This is the word of the Lord.
Going on now with the second part of our short series. It's only going to be 3 weeks, last week, this week and next, and then we go into Advent. But this is a short series called The Life to Come. And today we're looking at the second part of that. And as I said last week, most contemporary believers give very little thought to the last sentence in the Nicene Creed, which reads, I confess one baptism for the forgiveness of sins, and I look forward to the resurrection of the dead and the life of the world to come. And I really like the way it puts it there in the Nicene Creed. It talks about the life of the world to come. And as I explained last week, the ultimate outcome for believers is not to go to some spiritual place up in the sky, but to be restored in resurrected bodies on a restored earth. That is the biblical vision, right from beginning to end. It's a constant theme right throughout the Bible, and for a whole bunch of reasons, one of them being that we have been influenced by Greek mythology and Greek thinking and Greek education. In the West in particular, we have a different vision of the world to come that's been sort of handed down to us through our bloodstream almost, and that is one of kind of golden gates and angels in the sky and all that kind of thing. And as I have always been hoping to do along the way is to correct that way of thinking and get us into a more Jewish biblical understanding of the life to come, of the world to come, as the Nicene Creed puts it, because it's a world we're going to inherit. The meek shall inherit a cloud in the sky. I don't think that's what it says. It said the meek shall inherit the earth. And always at the centre of what God is doing with his people, whether it be Israel, was a promised land. But that promised land is the whole earth in the end for the people of God. And so as a result of this misstep, in the West at least, many believers have a vision of a life to come that is some kind of giant, kind of cosmic holiday that is themed around whatever it is that floats your particular boat. I don't know what, some people have the dream that the life to come will be a giant golf course. I can think of nothing more frustrating myself, but anyway. Some people have an idea of a kind of a Monet-esque landscape with classical Baroque music gently playing in the background, while cherubs bring forward platters of peeled grapes and that kind of thing. You know the kind of Western kind of vision of paradise, which is handed to us by the Greeks, by the Greco-Roman world, not by the Bible. But here's the thing. As nice as a long, everlasting holiday sounds, holidays are only good in the context of work. I knew a couple who had worked really hard, very successfully at a business they'd both worked on. They live here in Adelaide, I know them personally. And they were able to retire at the tender age, that seems tender now to me, is 50. So they retired when they were 50. They had as much money as they would ever need for the rest of their life. And in fact, they had so much money they could build their own yacht, which they built in their backyard, with the help of builders and so on. But anyway, they built a beautiful yacht and they sailed the world, and it was all looking pretty good. But after 1 year, they were bored. They came back to Adelaide and started their business again. And they've been working ever since and loving it. Because, holidays are great, but you can't be on holiday forever. And the world to come is not going to be an endless holiday. It's not just going to be, all beer and Skittles, or wine, for that matter. It's going to be a whole lot more than that. Yes, there is an element of celebration, and there is an element of that, but that's not the big thing. The big thing for our humanity is work. Work is one of the most satisfying things you can do. I mean, John Farnham tried to retire. How many times did he try to retire? I couldn't even get a straight answer about that from the internet, by the way. No one seems to know how many times he retired. Or as I heard one person quip, John Farnham's farewell tour has gone on for 15 years. So the point is that work, and I don't just mean work for money, I mean a vocation, a calling. As I'm now coming to realise that when you retire, that you keep on working. You might not be making money, but you work, yeah? And you get about work that's satisfying and interesting, because you're not working for money anymore, you're working for something, you're working for the things you really want to do. It might be looking after your family, it might be pursuing a hobby, it might be doing something like helping the poor or whatever it is. I recently was involved in a tree planting exercise, and I was one of the youngest people there. Most of the people were in their 70s and few of them were in their 80s, and they were out there bending their backs, planting trees. And interestingly, they were planting trees they would never see grow. And why were they doing it? Because work is interesting. Because they felt called to it. It's a vocation. It's not just, they weren't doing it for the money, obviously. They weren't doing it because they were going to enjoy the shade of those trees in the fullness of time. They were doing it because they felt they were called to it. It was meaningful and worth doing. So people do bush care and volunteer roles in, Meals on Wheels, those kinds of things. Why do people do it? Because it's meaningful and satisfying and it's going somewhere. Which brings me to what I want to say about part 2 of this series on the life to come, and that is that in the life to come, we are called to a vocation, and our vocation is to be sons of God. Now, I'm using the word sons, the masculine form, not we are sons and daughters, yes, but there is the reason I'm going to just talk about us being sons of God because of the biblical phrase, sons of God, and what that means. We're all sons of God. Not just, I don't mean that in the masculine male sense, but in the sense of being invested with authority to rule. That's what that term means. We're also all going to be the bride of Christ. I'm going to be the bride of Christ, but I'm not going to take offence about the feminine side of that. So really this message is on being a son of God. What does that actually mean? Well, if we're going to understand what the phrase son of God means, then we have to understand it within the context of the ancient world and of the Bible. Because when we 21st century Christians hear the phrase Son of God, we tend to think of either Jesus, naturally enough, which is fair enough, as the supreme Son of God. And I'll say a little bit more about that later on. or in terms of those who have been adopted into the family of God, that's you and I, as it says in Romans 8:14, for instance, and there are many other verses like it. For all who are led by the Spirit of God are the sons of God. And again, we rightly think of that in terms of being brought into the family of God and given intimacy with God the Father and the familial privileges that come with it, which is all fine and good. That's as good as far as it goes. But to really understand what the title Son of God, or being a Son of God, means, we have to see the broader context, because the term Son of God had broad usage in the ancient world and appeared right across many cultures and languages, particularly in the Near East, in the Mesopotamian area, which includes, that big strip of land between Egypt and Babylon, which includes Jerusalem and so on. That, the cradle of civilization, all that. The term Son of God was being used across all the cultures in the area long before the Jews were even a thing. And generally speaking, the term Son of God referred to someone who had been invested with divine power for the task of rulership. So ancient kings, for instance, in the Near East were commonly referred to as sons of God. And, I haven't got time to go into referring to all of the ways that the Mesopotamians and the Egyptians and so on referred to their kings as sons of God. But we had Psalm 2 read to us this morning. And in verse 6 it says, "As for me," this is God speaking, "I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill." And then David speaks and says, "I will tell the decree. The Lord said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I'll make the nations your inheritance and the ends of the earth your possession." So David is saying, he's not saying, "I am literally divine." He's not saying that. What he's saying is, God is given me a mandate to rule. And of course, we now look at that Psalm 2, and Psalm 2 is one of the most quoted Old Testament verses in the entire rest of the Bible. It's referred to obliquely and actually many times in the New Testament, in the book of Revelation and the Gospels and so on. And Jesus would say that was referring in a shadow form to David, yes, as one appointed by God to rule. But of course he was a way less than perfect ruler, in case you hadn't noticed. Murderer, adulterer, so on. But the perfect example, or the perfect Son of God, is Jesus, who is the full mandate of God to rule not just Israel, but the entire world. The ends of the earth would become his possession. The emperors of Rome, for instance, were often called sons of God. Interestingly, I only found out yesterday that Rome didn't call their kings sons of God until after Alexander the Great introduced the idea of being called a son of God to the more European arena of the world, because when he invaded the Babylon and so on, he actually asked the locals how he should style himself as a king, and they said, "You should call yourself a son of God," and said, "Yep, sounds good to me." And he went with it. Plenty of modern politicians seem to think the same way now, but anyway. But the emperors of Rome called themselves sons of God. On the coins that they minted, you would often see an image of the king, of the emperor, and then under it, it would have Son of God. And again, most Roman emperors didn't think that they were divine. They didn't go around saying, "I fell out of the sky, I'm a child of God in the sense that I've been divinely created." Rather, all they're saying when they say Son of God is, "I've been given a mandate. God has chosen me to rule over you." Now, of course, that I'm pretty sure there are some contemporary leaders in the world who think exactly that right now, the divine right of kings and all that. And that, of course, leads to the most horrible abuses of power, because they're not really under God. They're just saying, you should obey me, because to disobey me is to disobey God. And of course, we can see how that goes sideways pretty hard, pretty often in world history. So naturally, the ancient kings didn't mind referring to themselves as sons of God, because they were really saying, "I'm divinely mandated, so don't stand against me." Now, most kings took that authority and used it to serve themselves, unfortunately. Anyway, that's the first way that the term Son of God is used, to refer to kings in particular. And the other usage of the word Son of God referred to what we would call angelic beings who had been given divine authority to rule. So generally these beings were referred to in the plural as the sons of God. So, for instance, in the opening chapters of the book of Job, it says that the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord. And a similar thing is said later in chapter 2, verse 1, and also 38, verse 7. It talks about the sons of God, plural, being beings that were given a mandate to rule in certain arenas. Now, these particular angelic beings weren't just messengers like most of the angels were. These were sort of the big woolly angelic beings that had been given authority to rule, and they were often referred to as the gods of the ancient world. And many of these beings ended up being worshipped and became the gods of the ancient world, created but nonetheless referred to as gods or sons of God. And there are other references of a similar nature to the angelic beings being called sons of God. Genesis 6 verse 2, Deuteronomy 32 verse 8, Psalm 82 verse 6, and many others besides that refer to these angelic beings. So for the most part, that is what the sons of God were known as. Beings, created beings, whether human or angelic, who had been given divine authority to rule, and that's how it was understood in the ancient world. So, so that's the simplest form. Now, of course, we can go and talk about the Son of God, which is Jesus. I'm only going to refer obliquely to this just because we haven't got time to go into in detail. But when Jesus appeared, calling himself the Son of God, or when God himself from heaven referred to him as the Son of God, for instance, in Matthew 3, verse 17, after Jesus was baptized, a voice from heaven said, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." Now, if you're a Jew and you heard that, what are you thinking? You're thinking Psalm 2. Are you not? I said to you, "Today I have become your father, and you are my son." Here is God from heaven saying, "This is my true Son." And the thing about Jesus, of course, he's been given a divine mandate to rule as the Messiah, as the chosen one, but no one else ever had a voice from heaven or the Holy Spirit come down and anoint them like Jesus. Jesus is unique. Jesus is not like the other sons of God, small s son. He is the Son of God, the quintessential Son, the capital S Son, or as some people would like to say it, he is God the Son. So he's God, the Son of God, the second member of the Trinity. However, whenever an ancient heard the Son of God in the New Testament, in the Gospel, they weren't thinking second member of the Trinity like we do, because that wasn't even a thing back then. They were thinking in terms which I just explained, that someone who has a divine mandate to rule. And of course, the person who has the greatest mandate is the Messiah, the one chosen by God to rule not only Israel but the world, fulfilling Psalm 2. So Jesus was not only claiming to be a Son of God, but God himself. And that claim was validated by the voice of God and also by his victory over death. You see, other kings can come claiming many things, but Jesus doesn't just make claims, he actually overcomes death. You know, actually, I was watching a YouTube video the other day, and someone was talking about, it was a comedy sketch about the American elections, and they were interviewing people on the street, and somebody said, "You know what I'd really like to see? I'd really like to see a president who's going to put an end to death. That's what's really worrying me." And it was given as a joke, but I thought, you know what? That would be a thing, wouldn't it? And here's the thing, Jesus is that king who has overcome death. And, you know, any other claim, you know, I'm going to set the economy right. Well, big deal. Jesus has overcome death. That makes him the Son of God. And he's the one who brings victory. And here's the other thing. The ancient world understood that victory only came at the hand of the gods or of God. Victory couldn't be brought about just by human factors alone. Only God could bring victory. So when Jesus has victory over death, that is a claim to the ancients that he is God, because he overcame death and gives him the greatest mandate ever. You know, Antiochus Epiphanes, who was the Seleucid king that ruled over Israel back, in the time of the Maccabees. He actually claimed that he was not only a son of God, but he was a manifestation of God himself. That's how much hubris he had. And on his coins, he started off by just putting his name on the coins. Then he went Epiphanes, which means the appearance of God, God manifest. And then finally, in his last iteration of his coins, he actually put out coins that said, God manifest, the bringer of victory. This guy had tickets on himself, let me just say. But Jesus comes and puts all those guys in the shade, all the other so-called sons of God, he puts them in the shade because he's the true king over all kings. And as John describes him in John chapter 1, verse 18, he says, no one has ever seen God, but the one and only Son, who is himself God and is in the closest relationship with the Father, has made him known. So Jesus actually is God, and he makes God known. And when it says that he is the one and only Son, that actually means, the Greek word there is monogenes, which means one of a kind. Mono, one, and genus, kind. He is literally one of a kind. There's nobody else exactly like Jesus. Jesus is capital S Son of God. All right, so what does that all have to do with us? Well, at the end of the genealogy recorded in Luke's Gospel, we read of Seth, who was a son of Adam, the son of God. That's Luke 3, verse 38. What does that say? As far as Luke was concerned, Adam is a son of God. But he's not son of God in the same way that Jesus is, but again, we go back to the ancient usage of the word. What was Luke saying that Adam was? He was appointed by God to rule, to be a son of God, to be a king on earth. So what does this tell us? Adam, together with Eve, had royal authority as proxies of God to rule the earth. And certainly that's how Genesis puts it when it's in Genesis 1, verse 27 and onwards. It says, so God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air. I've been devoting my life to doing those two things. And over every living creature that moves on the ground. Can you see that's a vocation, it's a calling. The word vocation literally means vocare, call in Latin. You are called by God to be sons and daughters of God, to rule as a royal priesthood on earth. That was what Adam was designed to do. He wasn't designed just to be another creature. He had been given the role in the image of God. And of course, if you were building a temple, you would put the image of your God in that temple. And God had built a temple for himself, which is the earth, and he put his image in it, which is humanity. And then he said to them, now I want you to take what's here in this temple of Eden and Edenize the whole earth. Take it out and spread it around. Put my image everywhere, increase my image everywhere, and rule over the birds and the fish and all the creatures. And by rule, it doesn't mean use jackboot diplomacy and get what you want out of it and destroy the earth, but rather care for it and nurture it and bring it to its fullness, that it would all be like Eden. And of course, that's a lot of metaphoric language in that, but that was the big plan. Now, in the evangelical church, we've tended to emphasise in the whole matter of reconciliation and redemption and salvation that we're brought back into the family of God as children of God, and that we have access to God as Father. And this is coupled with our vision of a life to come that is an endless holiday which obscures the truth of the ultimate point of redemption. The point of redemption is not to be redeemed. The point of redemption, it's in the word, is to be brought back to what you were created to be in the first place. You know, take for instance the story of the prodigal son, which we had read to us, a part of it at least this morning. You remember that in that story we have a great, beautiful story of forgiveness and of reconciliation. You know, here's a son who is undeserving of forgiveness and of the love of his father. And rightly, we use this story to underscore the point that we have been given grace by God and forgiveness. Nothing wrong with that, that's all good. However, if we read the story a little bit more closely, we discover that the prodigal was not only forgiven, but was reinstated to full sonship when the father said to the servants, "Quickly bring the best robe and put it on him, put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet." Now, doubtless I've said it before, but the robe bore the family colours. It would be like if it was a Scottish family, if the prodigal son was from a Scottish family, he would have been given his family tartan. Put a kilt on his waist, it would have said, not a robe on his back. And the ring, of course, was like the credit card, the family credit card, the expense account. You know, I used to have an expense account in one church I was serving in. I was given a very tight budget, by the way. But I wasn't given an expense account so I could just wine and dine people. I was given an expense account because I had a job to do. And the credit card for the son is because he's got a job to do, because he's a son of his father. And the sons of the father rule over the household. And almost certainly the way the story is told is this family is well-to-do. They have servants, probably have servants' quarters. In fact, when the son came back to the father, he said, "Don't treat me as a son, treat me as one of your servants. Put me in the servants' quarters. I'll work for 3 meals a day." And he said, "I won't have you as a servant. I'll only have you as a son with full authority to rule over the household with me, alongside me. That's what I want for you. And I'm not going to just forgive you, I'm going to reinstate you." And that's the whole point of salvation and redemption. That's only a means to the end. The end is actually the big deal. The point of the Christian faith is not being forgiven of sins. It's being forgiven of sins in order that you can be a son of God. With your robe on your shoulders, the credit card on your hand, and the sandals. Only the sons wore sandals, the slaves wore bare feet. He's saying you are fully reinstated. And the meaning of all that is that in the world to come, we're meant to be not sidetracked by notions of feasts and endless celebration, although that's included. The celebration phase is only a short phase, though. You know, when a child finishes their education, we celebrate that as almost like a rite of passage. But celebrations mark the end of one phase of life and the beginning of another. And there will be a celebration, the wedding feast of the Lamb. On the day of judgment, we're going to be ushered into a feast. Now, this is all metaphoric language, of course, as I said last week. If you didn't hear last week's message, look it up on the website or YouTube. Because we see in there that God had to describe the things in the world to come metaphorically because they're beyond our understanding. Nevertheless, we're going to be ushered into a celebration, but the celebration is the marking of the end of this phase and the beginning of another. And we're going to start a whole new thing, and we're going to be put to work. The prodigal son, after the celebration was over, guess what he did? Probably that went on for a week, but after a week of celebration, what happened the next Monday? Back to work. And in the world to come, it's back to work. It's not an endless holiday. You've got a calling. And your calling is to be a son of God. And what that means is you've been given divine authority just like Adam had, just like Jesus has. In fact, if we read further on in the latter part of the scriptures, where we will be the sons and daughters of God, as Peter has it in 1 Peter 2, verse 9, a royal priesthood. That means you're given royal authority to mediate the presence and the power of God to the world. That's what the royal priesthood does. The Revelation 1 verse 6 and Revelation 5:10 says virtually the same thing. In other words, we will be restored as the proxies of God on earth. Now, right now, that might seem like a million miles away, but the day will come when we will shine with the glory of God and serve in the anointing that flows down from the true Son of God, which is Jesus. And as it is in the Revelation, in chapter 20, verse 6, it says, "But they shall be priests," that's referring to us who have been resurrected, "they shall be priests of God and of the Christ, and they shall reign with him." In other words, we will share in what the eldest son is doing, the great son, the capital S Son. We're going to be serving in his reign over the earth, alongside him and with him. And according to Paul in his letter to the Romans, this is the very thing that the whole of creation has been waiting for. For he says in Romans 8 verse 19 that the whole of creation waits with eager expectation for the revealing of the sons of God. Can you see what that's saying? What that's saying is all the trees and the moss and the anchovies and the mountains and the fields and everything else in creation is sitting around waiting for us to get our acts together, because they're sick of being poorly ruled by us. They've been sick of being ruled by rebels. What they want is the sons of God back. And one day, according to Paul, the ultimate outcome of all creation is that humanity will be restored to their position as the sons of God. And creation is, looking and going, tick-tock, people. We're really sick of being destroyed by you and maimed by you and polluted by you. It would be really good if you guys would get it together one day and be properly ruled over by God and enter into his kingdom, because then we will be restored and implicated in your restoration. Just as we've been implicated in your fall, we will one day be implicated in your restoration. And that is ultimately, the beginning of creation. God created the heavens and the earth, and then he created the things in it. And at the end of each stage, he says, "It is good, it is good, it is good." But when he created human beings, he said, "It is very good." Well, the only way it can be very good is when humanity is restored. When humanity takes up their place, reinstated, sons and daughters of God, then creation itself will also be implicated in our restoration. And that is the vocation that you will be called to in the life to come, the restoration of creation. I actually have a little private theory that we're going to be handed the world as it is right now, but it'll be a new order of things, and we will have fun putting it back together, bringing it to its glory, restoring it to the way it was meant to be. And to me, that sounds a whole lot more interesting and a whole lot more fun than an endless holidays, because holidays get boring after about a week. And this is what the big story of the gospel is leading us to. And that is good news indeed. Amen.